Hello, Daryl, Matt.
Hi, Wes.
Hey, yeah, it's Wes here. Trying to log in to your other site here.
Copy that. Well, we got 3 after. Why don't we get started? Okay, so we don't have a rigid agenda for today's meeting, but we do have Jason Jackson, who's a director at Intrado, who's going to present to us today about GIS for NG 911, and we may touch a bit about geospatial routing. Jason, would you like to start your presentation?
I can.
And Jason, you should have, if you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, there's a Present Now button, so you can present directly from your desktop.
I've got it, and the share button is not lighting up. Can you guys see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh.
There you go.
Yeah.
There we go.
So Jason, if you could give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself as well, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so my name is Jason Jackson. I am in Intrado, director of the GIS here at Intrado, and I have been here a year yesterday. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I was the first state 911 director for the state of Alabama. So completely understand what you guys are going through and making decisions and so forth. So just really want to take some time to share with you guys. This is A911, or this is part of it. And if when the I3 geospatial routing becomes a part of it, our spatial interface and validation tool, what we refer to as EGDMS, is built in. And this is kind of the steps that we would take to get you guys onto the system, all your data uploaded and so forth. Just kind of some of the requirements that we walk through. These are pretty high level. Didn't get too much into the weeds. Short presentation later in the day. Didn't want to bore everyone, but really this is what we base off of. We've got our 5 GIS required data sets. We got the provisional boundaries, the PSAPs, the street center lines, address points, and then, the jurisdictional boundaries when it pertains to fire law, EMS. We also completely abide by the NENA GIS standards document with the data models, and then all that we need for the ECRF and LVF, basically the geospatial routing piece of it. This is really kind of the high-level steps of what we would do. Once you're ready or wanting to move to that I3 geospatial routing in the A911 system, this is kind of the process we would go through. We would take your GIS data, essentially, would review it, and then we start into our portal and validation tool, EGDMS. We'd start to upload it. We'd train you guys on it, set you guys up with your passwords and so forth. Move on to the review and approve the schema and then move into the spatial interface validation reporting. Any errors come up, we move forward with that. The GIS data, make sure it's free of the critical errors, then we move on to the ALI to RCL comparison, then move into the correction and synchronization. Make sure we have a match rate of greater than 98% as stated by Nina standard. And then, confirm with you guys as well as with us, make sure we're all mutually on the same page as far as, okay, your data's ready to go. And then just kind of get into the testing phases for the routing pre-migration testing, go through that phase. And then, once that phase is done and all the other requirements from the next gen side are completed, we move forward with that. And I was able to, Rich Johnson is able to join us today. So any routing questions, I will defer to him, but he can help us with that. But it's really taking your data, going through the validations, all the testing, weed out all the errors, get it to that, 98% or higher match rate, and then really just moving forward with it.
Yeah, Jason, do you mind if I add a couple of things? Sorry.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Sure. So, hi, folks. This is Rich Johnston. I'm a solutions engineer over here at Intrado. So just, from a kind of operational or technical perspective, why do we need to do all that? Because what we're doing is when we're moving from an ESN-based routing infrastructure to a GIS-based routing infrastructure, we need to start, obviously, managing the GIS data day to day. But we also need to do comparisons to that existing, which Jason is talking about here, this 98% match rate. We need to do comparisons to that existing ALI data to make sure that they match up before we go live. Because the reason being is, even though once you do go live, you're going to manage your routing based off of that GIS information, all of the telephone service providers, until they're ready to do I3, which they aren't at this point, they're still going to need to validate against the MSAG. So we need to make sure that that is as close as we can, 98% or above, in sync before we move forward with GIS. So that's really the reason why we have to make sure all of those are good, to make sure that they match up before we deploy live, because the carriers are going forward will still continue to need to validate against the existing MSAG. But on the routing side, we're doing the routing based on the GIS information.
Say, Rich.
Everybody? Yeah.
Rich, this is Matt. We have probably a significant number of GIS folks on the call who are not necessarily 911 on the 911 side of the coin, and
okay,
it would be great if you could just touch on what MSAG and ALI mean and how they're used today with respect to converting using them to GIS data instead.
Yeah, absolutely. So the legacy kind of 911 environment. Now, what we've done in Colorado is we've moved that legacy infrastructure, that old TDM analog infrastructure, to an IP infrastructure. But the way that addresses are validated today are still kind of the old-fashioned way. And the way that they're validated today is there's, in essence, a flat file that says, and it's a tabular file. So it says, let's say it says Main Street, and you have a house range of 1 to 100 Main Street goes to a certain ESN, which tells the systems which PSAP location to send it to. So then you'll have another entry that says 200 to 300 Main Street goes to a different ESN. If there was a bordering answering point, that's how it's designated in the systems today, is to route to a different place. So it's a very tabular database.
Very similar to GIS center lines, but instead of being based on potential ranges, it's normally based on actual addresses.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And this is data that's been managed, honestly, for the last 30 years. So just as the GIS side of the house has to do, any new developments or changes in addressing that, MSAG should be and has been maintained. Now, what we do is, during part of that process that Jason's talking about, before we go live, is, we have the GIS, side of the house and folks with the road center lines and address points and layers. And we have the traditional 911 side of the house, and part of what needs to be done to make sure those are in sync, either that the GIS side of the house didn't miss something, or the MSAG side of the house hasn't missed something. So we just need to make sure that those databases are in sync before we go forward, because again, the telephone service providers will still use that tabular database to do all their validations until those telephone service providers can start sending in location information at the time of the call and validate against GIS information. So the telephone service providers are a little behind the curve still. They're still doing things the old-fashioned way. When we move to I3, we move everything we possibly can to I3. So assuming that the GIS information is good, that matchup rate is good, we will do the routing based off of the GIS information. But again, the telephone service providers, because they're not ready, still have to do things the old way. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're good. And Rich just touched on a lot of why we do what we do. Kind of going over that whole process, and it's really just making sure the boundaries exist. Again, according in the next gen world, when you're I3 routing, making sure the ESNs are matched up properly. Again, everything Rich just said, I won't repeat it for you guys' sake of time, but and really just kind of going through all those things. These are the best practices. This is what we do normally. As we go through this, Rich is probably much better at speaking at it from a routing standpoint than I am, so I'm glad he pretty much already covered all that. So, and that's really just going through those processes to get your data best route calls on. Again, Rich mentioned, carriers aren't really there yet, so we go ahead and try to, get all the data ready there. And usually what happens is when we do this, we provide what we call kind of an onboarding service. Each jurisdiction, PSAP, county, gets an I3 coach, a GIS coach. We go through EGDMS training a couple of different times. It can be web-based. We have provided in-service. I know there were sites in Virginia we provided in-service or on-site training. And I apologize, my Skype has a mind of its own. And then we move into the review and correction stage, kind of the validation stage of the ALEC to GIS report that we'll do. And then we just have regular Q&A support. Constantly can contact us. The coach is always available afterwards. And then, of course, once everything's turned on, we give you go live support and then continuing maintenance support with that as well. And it's kind of, referred to as onboarding services, really just to get all your data into our data portal, our EGDMS, and then to move on from there. And that's really it at a high level. Again, I wasn't going to get into other stuff. There's, other services we can talk about as we move forward, but this is really to get everyone to the stage that they need to be in. To get to that next gen I3 geospatial routing phase. This is really the steps that we take.
Thank you for the overview. And I think at this point, I'd like to open it up to the committee members and see if they have questions to ask of the Intrado folks or Wes from CenturyLink.
You got a message on chat.
We have a question from Laura Duran. Is the data workflow one way, meaning from GIS to Intrado, but not backwards?
No,
it goes. Go ahead, Rich. No, go ahead.
So yeah, no, it's interactive. So you would see through this training and our documentation that, again, we have a web-based portal that would be a two-factor authentication for someone to log on to the user interface. The user interface, then you go through a bunch of different validations. For instance, if this was ongoing, not the first time, you can update certain layers or update everything, and we can give you documentation if you ever want to see that. But you can go through and do all your files or just certain files. We then go through as part of our process our QA/QC checks, right? That if there's no overlaps or holes or anything like that. If there are, then we will error out those, and we do provide via our portal kind of error and statistical reports. So you'd be able to see why it had a problem with our system, if it was one of those critical errors, and why. So you'd be able to download those reports to see what you needed to fix, if it was a formatting issue or whatever it was. Now, if it does go through, great. You'll also get a statistical file on that from that side of it to let you know that it went through and everything's up and running. So it is two-way there. It is a portal that you use to log on to the system. We also have an automated means if you don't want to physically, get onto a website and pull the file off your desktop. There is a service that we provide. We call it, I think, Move It, Jason, that allows it to be scripted and just to go into the system in an automated fashion once a day or something like that. Did I cover it?
Laura, does that answer your question? Not really. Maybe we can ask the question or answer it in a different way.
Could you repeat the original question, maybe, and I'll give it another shot?
Are you able to see the chat from the Google meeting?
Yeah, let me pull it up here. Sorry, I took it
You
down
bet.
for a second. Let's see. Here we go.
Ah,
Okay, I get you. So, Jason, do you want to talk towards this? I believe that it's not one of our normal functions, but I believe we can configure it to give you on a certain repetitious fashion or one time. If you want a download of our database, we can provide that. So, Jason, the question here is: once the data is uploaded, then can we download the data that, in essence, has been uploaded? So a couple different things. We can set up certain processes and procedures to do that. And Jason, you tell me if I'm wrong. The other thing is, in the I3 world, there's something called the LVF function, which is the location validation function. So when the carriers are ready, when the wireless and VoIP and wireline providers are ready to do I3, they have connectivity to this function through the internet to do validations of their own record. So in that case, that LVF is also available to you. So if you wanted to do kind of onesie, twosie validations, you could, because the snapshot of your data that we load for our routing function, we also load in this validation function. But if what you want is a big download of all your data, yeah, we can do that. And Jason, I don't know how that looks. I know that we've done it for customers in the past, but from an automated means, I don't know if that's part of the EGDMS or if that's a special request.
It can be done. What we have been doing is Rich mentioned, the Move It script that we have. Think of it like a box account where you load the data up and then it automates into our EGDMS, and it can be reversed that way as well. So if you wanted a full massive download, we could reverse and then send it to you, similar function for you to download as well. So it can be done.
This is Daryl Branson. I have kind of a question that is maybe uninformed because I'm not a GIS expert like a lot of the people on the call today. But what is the current state of geospatial routing from wireless calls? I know at one time there was a problem with the fact that the GPS fix was coming in too late for routing purposes. I don't know if that's still the case or if that's improved. Can you tell me where that's at yet? And if we
Sure.
can't route wireless calls geospatially because of that technological hurdle, what are the other benefits of geospatial routing?
Sure. I'll hit up both of those. So when we first did our first I3 deployment about 2 years ago now, what we were seeing was about somewhere between 6 and 8% of the information for wireless calls were coming in fast enough. And obviously that's not something that we control. We have to do, because those carriers haven't got to I3 yet, we're still using kind of traditional means to go retrieve that phase 2 latitude and longitude, that updated information. What I can tell you is over the last 2 years, whatever the wireless carriers are doing on the back end, we still see it as kind of the traditional we go and query. They're getting much, much faster. I would say the average now is somewhere between, just for wireless, is somewhere between 20 and 25%. We've done some big deployments lately, and I've checked it out, and it's really neat to see, because as their wireless carriers are changing their environments on the back end and going through whatever legal stuff they have to go through to be able to provide a better location, it is coming in faster for us. So what I would say is, right off the bat, I would look to something like 20-25% of all wireless calls are getting a phase 2 fix quick enough that we can route on it. All of the wireline obviously is routing on it, because that's kind of a static address that we geocode using your street center line information. So that's XY that you would have established, and all of VoIP, or I would say most of VoIP, because most of VoIP is static at this point. The other benefits are things like, if you did want to make a route, so aside from all the wireless stuff, which is great, off the bat, I'd say now you're looking at somewhere between 30 and 40% of calls are 20% of wireless calls, and 100% of your wireline VoIP calls are going to route geospatially. But aside from that, there's different functionality within our system that allows more real-time updates. So if you think of a big old addressing project that you had to do to change the responding parties, for 10,000 addresses, that was a relatively long process through the legacy means that you had to send through these address changes through a manual portal, that those, only a certain amount of address changes could be made per day. And so it got complicated and would take a lot of time to make those changes. From a GIS perspective now, those can be done very quickly. Those street center lines or address points can be updated almost real time from the routing side. Now, they still have to be made from the MSAG side, but there are additional services and tools to kind of make that update one and the same. So I don't know, Jason, if maybe for another time we can talk about our transitional data management service that allows PSAPs and GIS authorities to make all of their changes just through the GIS interface once it's up and running. So that's a real benefit. Other things that we can do with an I3 infrastructure are something we call special event routing. So we can load special event layers. So if there's a parade or a football game or something like that, there could be a special event layer sent in through the GIS interface. And then be activated so that rather, something that might have taken years to plan or didn't have the capability in the legacy tabular world, those now become available in this next generation world. So yes, first of all, you get a lot of benefit off the bat. The wireless carriers are doing a lot better getting those phase 2 information to us fast enough that we can route on it. But there's also other things surrounding readdressing and special event routing that become immediately available once GIS is used for routing. And maybe one other note, if for some reason, and it never should, but if for some reason that GIS database becomes unavailable or there's some issue, now we're fully redundant and diverse, so it should never happen. But if it does, then we can fall back to our ESN routing. Since we're still maintaining that MSAG, that old database, that tabular database, if there is a problem with GIS, we can still route based on the ESN because we're still maintaining that until all of the carriers move on to I3. Did I capture most of what you wanted?
Yes, I believe so. Thank you.
Sure.
So that would then mean, this is Matt, that would then mean that we're also going to be maintaining MSAG and ALI data in relation to your ESN-based route until every carrier is also transitioned or ready to transition.
Correct. So there are so that was the NINA defined model that legacy MSAG still needed to be maintained for anything on legacy. So all those mostly wireline and VoIP carriers. and then GIS needed to be maintained for the spatial routing. Now, again, if it's something you're interested in, CenturyLink and Intrado have come up with kind of a one-stop shop service to be able to say, okay, once we get everything matched at 100% or very close to it, now we can start doing things, what we call transitional data management, that once it's all matched up, now we can start looking at just accepting all the changes through the GIS side of the house. So, you know, if there's a new street or a range change or something like that, that would go through the GIS and then automatically come in on the other side and update the MSEG. Now, if for some reason that GIS, let's say you reduced a street range and it abandoned, orphaned some houses, then our system wouldn't change that. But then that it's at that point that we would either reach out to the GIS person or the MSAG coordinator, whoever you want to be in that process, to say, hey, this GIS change came through and it orphaned some houses. So either they need to be readdressed or you need to change your GIS information. So there is a offer for a service to kind of do a one-stop shop. But the way we developed it was the way kind of Nina defined it, which is legacy is on one side and GIS is on the other.
Does that cover your question, Daryl?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And then some. Who would like to answer the new question in the chat?
I think that might actually be for me, Matt. So this is Daryl. Rachel, I see your question. So I don't know if we have anybody who's just on the phone, but just in case, Rachel's question is, which level of government, state of Colorado versus each local PSAP, has the authority or governance to choose such a vendor-supported services on behalf of the 64 counties in Colorado? In other words, is this both a state question and a local question? Is this demo aimed at a state audience or a local PSAP audience? Colorado is very different than a lot of states in that we don't have any sort of state level funding for 911. The way we pay for it is through local governments paying into a tariff, and that tariff is approved at the state level by the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. And the part that the PUC regulates is anything related to aggregation, transporting, and routing of 911 calls to the point that it's handed over to the PSAP. So to the degree that we're talking about routing, that could be built into that tariff that we have statewide that all of the 911 centers then pay into to cover those services. If it's something outside of routing, you get in a little bit more of a gray area as to whether it could be built into a tariff or not, in which case, you know, if you're just talking about a local government contracting with a service provider to help maintain their GIS for other purposes other than just routing, then that may be something that would be more of a county by county issue. Rachel, I hope that answers the question. Our regulatory structure in Colorado can be a little hard to get your arms around at first.
Okay, do we have, well, Rachel, hopefully that answered your question. Do we have any other questions or a continuation of the current one? Kind of, sort of. Well, it's Colorado. I'm seeing from the presentation is that at minimum, an Intrado-based geospatial 911 service, they're going to perform the spatial interface function, which is, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong from Intrado, but the spatial interface function is where the GIS data gets uploaded to be used in the functional elements of I3 and G911. So the collector of the data, if you will.
Correct.
I have a new question from Ben Butterfield.
To Ben's question, is there a timetable that There's not an existing one. We try to do it, in an ESNet environment. There's so many different moving parts, and so the goal is always to go ahead and have all the data and so forth. And Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, but usually that 30 to 60 days to have that final testing, everything signed off on before a PSAP is ready to go live on the ESNet. That's usually been our aim and goal as we've deployed these throughout the country.
Yeah, I agree, Jason. I would say this is the best answer. It depends. So, and the reason I say that is it kind of depends on how much coordination there has been internal to a city or a county up to this point. So if you're pretty well coordinated with your GIS, with the MSAG side, the tabular side and the GIS side are pretty well coordinated, and you think it's pretty good, then there's not as long of a time frame as needed. If we were to look and see, and there haven't been lots of conversations there in the past, then you're probably going to need to do a lot more work to get those in sync than maybe if those operational folks have been aligned in the past. So it depends. We usually say, yes, 30 to 60 days prior to work out some of the kinks, but if there is a big deviation of data, we should plan for longer than that.
Yeah, I probably misworded that. The end state goal is always to have everything done 30 to 60 days prior to going live.
So I'll touch upon Rachel's question here briefly. I don't know from a state of Colorado perspective, but I can tell you from our system that what we look at is GIS authority. So who is Colorado or that specific jurisdiction designating as their GIS authority? So you could have one per PSAP, or you could have one for the whole state, or somewhere in between. And we've done that in all different areas of the country. So sometimes there's a state level GIS authority that all the local GIS authorities funnel up to, and then we accept, in essence, all of the data from that one authority. System can accept it all the way down to the PSAP authoritative boundary level. So from our side, from the CenturyLink and Entrado side, we can do either, but how it's going to be done for Colorado is up to you folks.
So you could, as a part of the spatial interface function in NG911, also perform the aggregation of the data, collecting it from each local county 911 authority or their designated GIS data provider. Correct.
Yeah. We've done it both ways. We've done it in certain states. I believe Arizona is per GIS authority, which is per city or county. And we've done it for other states that are statewide that already have an aggregator doing that. They've paid a third party resource to kind of get all that together, and that's who we work with. So either or, we can do that. Yep.
This is Daryl. I know we have some Colorado Office of Information Technology people on the call today. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but we've had these discussions in the past as to whether the GIS office at OIT would be able to, or not only able to, but have the funding and desire to take on that role. And I don't think we've ever really had enough specifics for them to be able to answer that question. So it may be a question that we'll have to readdress when we get a little further down the line on this. But as we just heard from Entrado, they can do it either way. They can take the data from a single state source, or they can work directly with local GIS personnel to aggregate the data.
I mean, and just to mention, there are additional functions that we can take on. So, as the spatial interface provider, we would take on all the individual data from the cities and the counties and the different GIS authorities. But if there's an overlap or something like that, in that case, we would refer it back to whoever overlapped and said, you have an overlap. There's additional services that we can actually become the overall authority for a certain area. And Jason, you can name some of the states that we're doing that. So it all depends. It depends on what level, from a spatial interface provider, from an I3 support perspective. Yes, we can accept it all from different jurisdictions and treat those jurisdictions separately. But in the case of, okay, there's an overlap here, who takes care of it? There are services that Intrado and CenturyLink can do to take a more active role to have us figure it out versus just putting it back on the local jurisdiction to figure out with their neighboring area.
So I think to clarify, you're talking about sorting out gaps and overlaps in the topologies between dispatch service area boundaries and emergency service agency boundaries. Is that correct?
Yes, or PSAP authoritative boundary areas, right?
That too, yeah.
Yeah, yep, exactly.
This is Joe Benkert. So we've had GIS vendors making presentations about how they would provide, amass, manage, create GIS data. And I understand Intrado provides certain GIS services, I think what was described at the beginning of this call, under the tariff. And then there are other GIS services that Intrado could provide, perhaps as a competitor to those other companies. And I think we need to be clear on, not being a GIS person, we need to be clear on what services fit into the different buckets.
Sure. Jason, do you want to talk towards that, or would you like me to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So the standard services, and Wes, keep me honest here, are as part of an I3 infrastructure. One of the services is that SI, that spatial interface, and that's what we provide as part of the I3 services. So that's the portal that the GIS authoritative agency would go in, would download their spatial data. We would validate that, provide you statistical files, whether it passed or failed or what the issues are. So that's our role here as part of an I3 vendor. The additional services, so there are additional services like onboarding. So that would be, is we help you along with that process to help you verify, your match rate between your spatial information and your tabular alley database. This TDMS service that I mentioned, which is a one-stop shop that you can send all your data in, and you don't have to worry about sending an MSAG updates anymore. Or this overarching service that you just mentioned that you've had GIS vendors come in there and offer to manage it on your behalf. Those are all additional services. So the main service that comes along with the I3 is that spatial interface function to allow you to update information into the 911 routing infrastructure for routing. Did that clear it up? And Jason, do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's it. It's the data portal, the spatial interface, the validations and the one location for the data to aggregate. So that's.
And so you're saying that we could have each authority be a data manager, or the state be a data manager, like through OIT, or Intrado could be the data manager. If Intrado is the data manager, that would be a separate contract outside of the tariff with a state or an individual jurisdiction. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes. If the expectation is that Intrado or CenturyLink Intrado is the overall GIS authority for the state, and that we would then work out the gap, overlap, any issues between the individual GIS authorities, then yes, that's outside of the tariff. But we absolutely, and our system is designed to be able to receive it from individual GIS authorities, whether or not that be jurisdiction city level or state level. Did I answer it?
Yeah, and so if we got to that point where we were trying to decide and we're going to an outside vendor for that rather than a jurisdiction or the state, then you would bid on that. And then there's also the matter, and I'm not sure where it falls, which is the creation of data, such as Brett's jurisdictions have pretty mature GIS data.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of smaller jurisdictions, rural ones, that have property boundaries, I think, and not much more, would need more development of the GIS data.
Sure.
And then there's another question I have, which has to do with open space or Forest Service lands. If we need to have trails and those sorts of things into the GIS database, and who does that?
Mm-hmm. So maybe to answer the second part of that question, sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, we would agree that we would bid that. We would be part of that from a vendor perspective if that offer were to come from the state. I apologize, I lost my place. The third part of that, yeah, if the expectation is that calls would be coming from that area, which it would be, we would need to have a spatial file for that, for those calls. So whether or not, I don't know, and I apologize, how Colorado with the state land works. Does that all get answered at one location, or is it divided up to local PSAPs or to some state level answering point? But we would need spatial boundaries for that. Oh, I do remember what I was going to say. For that middle question, the development of rural area GIS boundaries. There are some areas where we can get middle ground. If it's a rural area, and to be honest, you have one answering point that answers for an entire rural area that's not very complicated. You have one ambulance, one fire, one EMS. Then those, relatively generic ESN boundaries can be created relatively quickly. Again, that would be that jurisdiction's job to do it. Do you need address point level addressing or layers within your GIS information for a rural area? I think that's up for debate, understanding that you may only have one fire, police, and EMS responding to that whole jurisdiction. So I think some of those things, depending on the area, Denver, you're going to want a lot more detailed information than somewhere that's very rural.
The only follow-up is you had asked about in the Forest Service areas, who is responsible for that, and I don't know what the answer for that is, but how do other states deal with that you've dealt with?
Sure. Typically we'll find whoever the PSAP manager is for that area and go to them and ask. And typically there is either a city level or statewide jurisdiction level that manages that state land. So we would go to their departments to establish those boundaries.
Like the Forest Service or BLM pick up any of the costs for that?
That I don't know. I don't know where the costs are out, that aspect for Colorado.
I'm going to bet no.
I don't think they're going to pick up any costs that they haven't put an RFP out to pay for.
Yeah, ultimately, it's each local 911 authority that will be responsible for the provision of the GIS data for this service, whether it's they themselves or in partnership with city and county GIS departments or a contractor to develop and maintain and continually provide the data. That's up to them at the local level.
And if you don't mind me adding here, and this was developed specifically for this reason, is our system doesn't rely on a whole state going live for this type of routing. We developed our system a long time ago, and a long time ago, we've evolved to come up with a lot of different scenarios. If we're talking about 10 years ago or something like that, there were very few PSAPs that wanted to move in this direction, and most of the surrounding PSAPs answering points either wanted to stay on legacy or they wanted to move it, but they still wanted to do tabular. So our system is set up that we can have bordering answering points use different solutions. So if we were unsure of the forest land, we would leave that routing as tabular until that got figured out, but it wouldn't prevent us from turning Boulder up or Denver up. We can turn up different jurisdictions using different services. So it wouldn't prevent us from going live for the whole state if one PSEP wasn't sure of their direction.
Okay, do we have any other questions for our guests today? Well, I think without any more questions, it might be time to move on to the NINA GIS standards and related documents. On the GIS committee's webpage and in the Google Drive folder for the committee are about a dozen documents. They're mostly GIS standards, informational documents, required standards. Looks like we just got Daryl back. Daryl, are you going to be presenting or showing that folder?
Yeah, you should be able to see it right now.
Okay.
Is it not showing up?
I'm not seeing it.
Let me try stopping the presentation and starting again.
Okay. So there's about a dozen documents. I put together an outline that briefly touches on each of the documents. The top section of the outline sort of runs through some NINA standards that talk about the architecture of geospatial and G911 services. We have an EZNet, an IP network, on top of which we have functional elements that operate. And some of those key functional elements are GIS-oriented mechanisms. So Section 1 sort of steps through overviews within certain NINA documents so that you can learn about the architecture and those functional elements that will consume your local GIS data for the purposes of caller location validation and call routing to the correct PSAP. Section 2 really sort of dives into the GIS data itself and standards for those data. It starts with a couple of older standards. Probably the key one to start off with is going to be the second one there, synchronizing GIS databases with MSAG and ALI. You're going to want to do forward and reverse synchronization between your GIS address data and your MSAG ranges and ALI data. Then the next standard that's kind of the latest version of GIS data standards. It goes into what's needed, how they're used, touches a little bit on those functional elements again. And then the big one is the NG911 GIS data model. That NINA committee, they took years to put this together. It's very well thought out. This goes into layers and schemas. Now, it doesn't tell you what your field names have to be and so forth and so on, but it tells you what layers are needed. Some are required, some are strongly recommended. Again, a little bit about how that data would be consumed in an NG911 environment. And after the GIS data model was developed and published, there was a lot of call for GIS folks wanting a little more guidance on how to structure their data. And so the result of that was another new standard, the GIS data template. And included with that is a zipped folder that includes template files as example data structures for what will need to be provided for NG911. And then the last few documents they put extra focus on address point data. So you'll hear and read a lot about the PIDF-LO. That's the Internet Engineers Task Force, XML schema for, as it says, civic address data exchange. Now, this is a worldwide format used via the internet and other related types of services. So it includes some elements that are not used in the United States, but it is the vehicle for exchanging location data for NG911 as well. Nina took that another level and created the CLDXF, the next one down, and basically that's the PIDF-LO document minus the fields that don't apply to the United States. And then the last one is the document that goes into great detail about recommendations for where and how to place address points for use in NG911. So my recommendation would be for committee members to review these documents as you have time, work your way through them, and come up with a list of questions for our next meeting, and we'll see if we can get some answers.
And I just shared the link to the GIS committee webpage on the chat. So if you go to that page, down at the very bottom is the folder for where Matt has uploaded all of those standards he was just talking about. If you want to get a bigger view, you can go over here to the right side of that box, click out arrow, and it will list all of them separately. But that is available on there, and this is the zip file that he was talking about with the templates.
Do we have any further questions? All right, well, we got about 6 months of homework in front of us with all of these documents, don't we? It's a lot to read through, but this would be a good foundation for 911 stakeholders and local GIS departments to come to common understanding about what data is needed in what structures and why it's needed, so that we're all on the same page about why this is going to become a necessary ongoing thing for provision for NG911 services. And some of our 911 authorities are completely ready or nearly ready to provide this data, but other 911 authorities may be starting from scratch and may not be ready at all. And that's one of the other topics of concern I have for the GIS committee is, do we need to identify those weaknesses, or maybe it's not a weakness, but where we're a little bit behind, and mechanisms to help those folks get up to speed so that we can all do this together statewide. So something to think about for future agenda topics. Looks like we're just about at the end of our hour, so if we don't have any additional questions or comments, I think we'll call it a day.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody else.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.